Book Talk begins at 12 minutes and 31 seconds. Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 627, FeynBieHeimer. This episode of CraftLit is brought to you by our marvelous supporters over at Patreon. Visit patreon.com/craftlit and join Jennifer L., Sarah B., Kathy S., Kimberly K., Lisa B., and Madeline D. in supporting the show. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I'm vertical. I'm feeling pretty good about that. I did not do a whole lot yesterday, and so today I think I'm doing a little better. I'll tell you the weirdest thing. I cannot remember if I mentioned it because it wasn't in my notes, but I've been making gluten-free sourdough bread for about a month now. It's really not that difficult. It's different from making regular sourdough bread, but it's not that different. So I'm making it with gluten-free flour, and I have to say, beyond eating yogurt, which I know is kind of the go-to for gut health and stuff, I'm actually gonna say that the sourdough bread's doing more for me, surprisingly, than probiotic yogurt was. That was too hard on my stomach in its current tenuous state. So I'm just passing that along to you. Along with this, FeynBieHeimer. I know you've heard, those of you who are listening in real time have heard in the last month or so, all the talk about Barbenheimer and how the Barbie movie and the Oppenheimer movie both came out at the same time. And wow, you couldn't have gotten two more different movies, very, very popular all at once. And I'm actually going to say, from a craftly kind of point of view, there are, I think, important conversations that are being had in both movies, very different conversations, but important, culturally important for right now, conversations that are being had in both movies that are very much touching in on some of the young whippersnapper zeitgeist that I see happening. Basically, see happening through the kids, obviously, because I'm no whippersnapper. But the quandary that is presented in the middle of the Barbie movie by America Ferrera's monologue, which I swear to you, every young actress in the United States, at least for the next, I'm going to say 5 to 10 years, they are going to be using that monologue to audition with, because wow, it was just wow. That monologue, coupled with Oppenheimer's moral and existential conversation morass that you go through with him, to me, it's not that they're the same thing or even opposite sides of the same coin. It's that they are both incredibly important conversations to be having right now. The Barbie movie I found hysterical. Andrew and I practically started crying. We were laughing so hard at a couple points. I will tell you that we saw it with Mom, and I think she justifiably said there were a lot of sub-references, cultural sub-references that kind of went by her, which isn't a surprise. I am stuck listening to a 19-year-old an awful lot. And so I hear a lot more that world. So if you haven't been in touch with that world for a while, be prepared for some sub-references to go by you, but not as many as I would have thought. I thought Greta Gerwig did a really nice job, which makes me very happy after the Little Women bonnet debacle. So there's that. But then in Oppenheimer, we saw that this weekend. I was really quite pleasantly surprised / impressed at how entertaining the film was. I'm never disappointed with Christopher Nolan films in general. Sometimes they are more engaging than others, but they're always those kinds of movies that afterwards sit with you for a while and give you something real meaty to gnaw on in your brain. This was no different, but it was more entertaining during the movie than I had anticipated. And I'm sure if you've paid any attention at all, you've seen there have been criticisms of certain scenes in the movie. There have been criticisms of what's been left in and left out. I am going to link out to a video essay on why perhaps the decision to not include actual footage of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the devastation that was wrought there might have been a good idea. And the video essayist compares Oppenheimer, that section of Oppenheimer, to the Spencer Tracy and Montgomery Clift movie Justice at Nuremberg, where they did show the actual footage of the freeing of the people in the camps. So there's plenty to talk about there. But the title for this episode is FeynBieHeimer. So where's the Feyn come from? And it's Feyn, Feyn. Feynman shows up, played by the child of Meg Ryan and Dennis Quaid. He is barely in the film at all. You will notice him doing three things. Twice you will see him playing the bongos. That's how you know it's Feynman. But the third time you will see him, I'm pretty sure it's him, because it's a dark scene, getting into a car right before the Trinity test and explaining that the windshield will screen the UV rays. The reason I think this is Feynman is because once I start thinking about physics, I start thinking about Feynman. I never took physics. I wanted to take physics. It's a long story. I've probably told it on the podcast before, but Feynman is so funnily accessible. And he talks about not being good at math, which just makes me love him all the more. It means that, kind of like with Shakespeare, you can just let Feynman wash over you in the beginning. Don't fight it. Just go with it. It's like watching Christopher Nolan's Tenet. Just let it flow over you and don't think too hard. And you'll start to find yourself being able to follow his reasoning and what he's talking about. And it's really a lot of fun because Feynman gets such a kick out of talking about physics. So the reason why I think that scene was in fact him was because after we saw the movie, I'd watched a couple of video essays about about Oppenheimer, and then suddenly a Feynman audio only speech that he gave at Caltech, I'm pretty sure. It would have been in the 60s. He was asked to speak, actually, it may have been earlier, it may have been in the 50s, because the title of his speech was Los Alamos from Below. And in that, he talks about how they were handing out these dark glasses or these frames of very dark gelatin, like gel that you would put into a theatrical lighting fixture, that were black, so that you could look through those in order to look at the explosion, the test. Which, of course, makes everybody in the theater right now just absolutely crawl outside of their skin. When you watch, I will not spoil it for you. I will just let you know that I was curled up in a ball in the chair when you get to that scene of the test. But there is a character in there who jumps into the car, explains that it's because of the UV rays blocking out the light, and then on the actual speech that Feynman gave, he talks about doing this, and everybody else was thinking he was crazy, but he did. He watched, saw the immediate flash, closed his eyes, put his head down, opened his eyes, could see this big purple ball of light on the floor of the car and said, well, that's not it. That's the after image. And then looked back up and was able to watch the rest of the cloud do its mushroomy thing. And he's fascinating. Anyway, FeynBieHeimer, there's lots of really, it feels like the first time since COVID that there have been cultural conversations about something other than politics. And it's marvelous. I just found it to be marvelous. So, yeah, I had a great time. And I hope you go and see these in a theater. We did not see Oppenheimer in IMAX. I understand it is spectacular if you can. If you cannot, please do not feel bad about that. We did not see it in IMAX, and I found it to be absolutely flabbergastingly beautiful in that kind of awe-striking way, like awe and awful, as well as just beautiful. Because Christopher Nolan is a lovely, lovely filmmaker. All right, so I'm recording this on the Tuesday before our final day of August when we have our book club doing the Librarian of Banned Books. And then in September, we will be watching A Face in the Crowd for our movie night. I announced last week that you can up your support on Patreon in order to even just temporarily support the show and come to a movie night or a book club night. So that's available to you, which made me very happy over at Patreon. They have not always done the things I want them to do. And this one, whoo, finally. The books from this month's raffle have been sent out. If you, as a winner, have not received yours by the time you are hearing this, please contact me on email. I've gotten notification that 2 of the deliveries have been made. I'm not sure what's up with the third one. We will have a brand new raffle during the month of September, and it is for really quite a treasure trove of books from listener Anne Blanton. So huge thanks to Anne, and more details on those books for you in the next episode. All right, so last week's chapter was Porthos. It was Porthos and his vanity and his depression about being denied remuneration and affection from his Duchess, who was really just a kind of frumpy lawyer's wife who's probably my age. Oh, poor Porthos. D'Artagnan lets him off the hook, doesn't push it, and instead allows Porthos to continue his rehabilitation and moves on to finding Aramis. So today's chapter is Aramis. And if you recall, one of the things that has been a storyline surrounding Aramis this whole time is that he was supposed to go into the clergy. He was supposed to be a theologian, to work in the world of religious orders. And he's obviously no dummy. I mean, Aramis is erudite and definitely comes across that way. It's, as I've said before, one of the reasons why I thought Richard Chamberlain was such inspired casting for him for the 1973 Three Musketeers movie. I mean, it's like Aramis is classy, is what I'm trying to say here. So if Porthos has gone into an eating despair vanity pit during his confinement while he's recovering, Aramis is most likely going to go down a theological route while he is recovering from whatever trouble he got into. This is true, and I've never had to do this before, but I am definitely doing it for this chapter. I am creating a PDF of the public domain version of this chapter with footnotes in it for you to download at craftlit.com/627, because I cannot fill you in. I cannot fill you in on all the jokes that are here. They are many layered. Dumas does really quite an excellent job of giving you repeat performances. So one of the characters will say something in Latin and another one will follow it up with a response that makes it clear what the Latin was, or sometimes they actually repeat it in French originally, but English now for us. And so you're able to follow the conversation whether or not you understand the Latin. That's absolutely true. You will not have any problem. You will miss a bunch of jokes. And you will also miss a bunch of biblical references, direct biblical references. And some of those are actually kind of important and interesting. There's a whole thing with Judith. Judith was one of the Apocrypha. She's one of the apocryphal books in the Bible, one of the books that was taken out. Her story is kind of Esther-like. She was a heroine. She saved her people, blah, blah, blah. But there's more to it than that. So don't sweat the Latin. Please feel free to download and take a look at the PDF. If you want to, you can do it while you're listening. You can do it after you're listening. It's there for you to decide. You can not look at it at all and just let the chapter wash over you. Free will. We are all about free will. But there are a few terms and finer points that I wanted to make sure you went into this chapter knowing. One is a calotte, C-A-L-O-T-T-E, which is a skull cap. Curate. We hear the word curate all the time. A curate in France, especially a Catholic curate, is actually slightly different than British C of E curate. For one thing, cure is a version of the word care. These are people who were responsible for the care of the parishioners' souls. So a curate, instead of being a layperson or somebody who's working their way up in theological ranks, a curate was actually, in our situation, the chief priest of a parish. So standard order priest responsible for the parishioners. A Jesuit superior, Jesuit meaning really, really learned, knows his Latin. A superior like a mother superior, that's a person who's responsible not just for, like a mother superior being responsible for all the nuns in a particular convent, a large convent. A superior, a Jesuit superior would be a priest who was responsible for a whole province or county, a larger area. So big mucky muck in the church. You'll hear a reference to a scourge, the kind of nasty thing that you beat yourself with if you are feeling that you need to punish yourself for sins, I guess, of the flesh, mostly. Unctuously is excessively ingratiating. Heresiarch. Heresiarch? Heresiarch. I have no idea. They are the founder of a heretical sect. So there's that. There's also a reference to a 16th century poem form, which if you've ever taught or taken English poetry classes, you will probably recognize. It's a rondeau, R-O-N-D-E-A-U. It was a French form. 13-line poem, 5 lines, 3 lines, 5 lines. There are only 2 rhymes ever in any stanza. And the first line that opens the poem is the end refrain of stanzas 2 and 3. Now, interestingly, Dumas makes it clear that Artemis believes this to be a rondeau, but we only ever get 5 lines. And in the Victorian version, you will get them in French and then translated in English. The modern translation of the book that I have does not include the French and has a not insignificantly different translation of the poem itself. I'm actually going to go out on a limb here and say I liked the Victorian one better, just on a first take. I will give you the other one in the PDF that I provide for you, so you can take a look and see what you think. And then in previous chapters, we've had comedy routines that are very Abbott and Costello. This one reminds me a lot more of Cyrano. And the Cyrano parts are D'Artagnan. D'Artagnan's asides, it is very, very much written like it were a play. It's like the Jesuit priest and the curate can't hear D'Artagnan, but Aramis can and we can. They do not respond to him when he's being a smart mouth. There's a different layer of humor that's going on with the curate and the Jesuit. The Jesuit very pompously, constantly will speak in Latin. The curate really doesn't know Latin a whole lot better than D'Artagnan does. And as a consequence, you will hear him just repeat things. It is a comedy routine I have seen done well often. It is written very well here. So just listen to the pace. The pace of the humor is beautifully parsed out in this chapter. All right, I think that's it. Here we go. Don't forget, if you need to download the PDF or you want to download the PDF before you listen, you are more than welcome to at craftlit.com/627. And if you are listening to the John Lee version of the audiobook, you can skip ahead to 1 hour, 2 minutes, and 50 seconds and pick up the book talk there. All right, here we go with chapter 26 of The Three Musketeers, written by Alexandre Dumas. Here we go.
Chapter 26 of the D'Artagnan Romances, Volume 1, The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas, translated by William Robson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Aramis and his thesis. D'Artagnan had said nothing to Porthos of his wound or of his procurator's wife. Our Béarnais was a prudent lad, however young he might be. Consequently, he had appeared to believe all that the vainglorious musketeer had told him, convinced that no friendship will hold out against a surprised secret. Besides, we feel always a sort of mental superiority over those whose lives we know better than they suppose. In his projects of intrigue for the future, and determined as he was to make his three friends the instruments of his fortune, D'Artagnan was not sorry at getting into his grasp beforehand the invisible strings by which he reckoned upon moving them. And yet, as he journeyed along, a profound sadness weighed upon his heart. He thought of that young and pretty Madame Bonacieux who was to have paid him the price of his devotedness. But let us hasten to say that this sadness possessed the young man less from the regret of the happiness he had missed than from the fear he entertained that some serious misfortune had befallen the poor woman. For himself, he had no doubt she was a victim of the cardinal's vengeance, and as was well known, the vengeance of his eminence was terrible. How he had found grace in the eyes of the minister he did not know, but without doubt Monsieur de Cavois would have revealed this to him if the captain of the guards had found him at home. Nothing makes time pass more quickly or more shortens a journey than a thought which absorbs in itself all the faculties of the organization of him who thinks. External existence then resembles a sleep of which this thought is the dream. By its influence, time has no longer measure, space has no longer distance. We depart from our one place and arrive at another, that is all. Of the interval past, nothing remains in the memory but a vague mist in which 1,000 confused images of trees, mountains, and landscapes are lost. It was as a prey to this hallucination that D'Artagnan traveled, at whatever pace his horse pleased, the 6 or 8 leagues that separated Chantilly from Crèvecœur, without his being able to remember on his arrival in the village any of the things he had passed or met with on the road. There only his memory returned to him. He shook his head, perceived the cabaret at which he had left Aramis, and putting his horse to the trot, he shortly pulled up at the door. This time it was not a host but a hostess who received him. D'Artagnan was a physiognomist. His eye took in at a glance the plump, cheerful countenance of the mistress of the place, and he at once perceived there was no occasion for dissembling with her, or of fearing anything from one blessed with such a joyous physiognomy. "My good dame," asked D'Artagnan, "can you tell me what has become of one of my friends whom we were obliged to leave here about a dozen days ago?" "A handsome young man, 3 or 24 years old, mild, amiable, and well made." That is he, wounded in the shoulder."
"Just so. Well, monsieur, he is still here."
"Ah, pardieu, my dear dame," said D'Artagnan, springing from his horse and throwing the bridle to Planchet. "You restore me to life. Where is this dear Aramis? Let me embrace him. I am in a hurry to see him again."
"Pardon, monsieur, but I doubt whether he can see you at this moment."
"Why so? Has he a lady with him?"
"Jesus! What do you mean by that? Poor lad! No, monsieur, he has not a lady with him."
"With whom is he then?"
"With the curate of Montdidier and the superior of the Jesuits of Amiens."
"Good heavens!" cried D'Artagnan. "Is the poor fellow worse, then?"
"No, monsieur, quite the contrary, but after his illness grace touched him, and he determined to take orders."
"That's it," said D'Artagnan. "I had forgotten that he was only a Musketeer for a time."
"Monsieur still insists upon seeing him?"
"More than ever."
"Well, monsieur has only to take the right-hand staircase in the courtyard and knock at number 5 on the second floor."
D'Artagnan walked quickly in the direction indicated, and found one of those exterior staircases that are still to be seen in the yards of our old-fashioned taverns. But there was no getting at the place of sojourn of the future abbé. The defiles of the chamber of Aramis were as well guarded as the gardens of Armida. Bazin was stationed in the corridor, and barred his passage with the more intrepidity that after many years of trial, Bazin found himself near a result of which he had ever been ambitious. In fact, the dream of poor Bazin had always been to serve a churchman, and he awaited with impatience the moment, always in the future, when Aramis would throw aside the uniform and assume the cassock. The daily renewed promise of the young man that the moment would not long be delayed had alone kept him in the service of a musketeer, a service in which he said his soul was in constant jeopardy. Bazin was then at the height of joy. In all probability, this time his master would not retract. The union of physical pain with moral uneasiness had produced the effect so long desired. Aramis, suffering at once in body and mind, had at length fixed his eyes and thoughts upon religion, and he had considered as a warning from heaven the double accident which had happened to him, that is to say, the sudden disappearance of his mistress and the wound in his shoulder. It may be easily understood that in the present disposition of his master, nothing could be more disagreeable to Bazin than the arrival of D'Artagnan, which might cast his master back again into that vortex of mundane affairs which had so long carried him away. He resolved then to defend the door bravely, and as betrayed by the mistress of the inn, he could not say that Aramis was absent. He endeavored to prove to the newcomer that it would be the height of indiscretion to disturb his master in his pious conference, which had commenced with the morning, and would not, as Bazin said, terminate before night. But D'Artagnan took very little heed of the eloquent discourse of Monsieur Bazin, and as he had no desire to support a polemic discussion with his friend's valet, he simply moved him out of the way with one hand, and with the other turned the handle of the door of number 5. The door opened, and D'Artagnan went into the chamber. Aramis, in a black gown, his head enveloped in a sort of round flat cap, not much unlike a calotte, was seated before an oblong table, covered with rolls of paper and enormous volumes in folio. At his right hand was placed the superior of the Jesuits, and on his left the curate of Montdidier. The curtains were half drawn, and only admitted the mysterious light calculated for beatific reveries. All the mundane objects that generally strike the eye on entering the room of a young man, particularly when that young man is a musketeer, had disappeared as if by enchantment, and for fear, no doubt, that the sight of them might bring his master back to ideas of this world, Bazin had laid his hands upon sword, pistols, plumed hat, and embroideries and laces of all kinds and sorts. In their stead, D'Artagnan thought he perceived in an obscure corner a discipline cord suspended from a nail in the wall. At the noise made by D'Artagnan in entering, Aramis lifted up his head and beheld his friend. But to the great astonishment of the young man, the sight of him did not produce much effect upon the Musketeer, so completely was his mind detached from the things of this world. "Good day, dear D'Artagnan," said Aramis. "Believe me, I am glad to see you."
"So am I delighted to see you," said D'Artagnan, "although I am not yet sure that it is Aramis I am speaking to."
"To himself, my friend, to himself. But what makes you doubt it?"
"I was afraid I had made a mistake in the chamber, and that I had found my way into the apartment of some churchman. Then another error seized me on seeing you in company with these gentlemen. I was afraid you were dangerously ill."
The two men in black, who guessed D'Artagnan's meaning, darted at him a glance which might have been thought threatening, but D'Artagnan took no heed of it.
"I disturb you perhaps, my dear Aramis," continued D'Artagnan, "for by what I see I am led to believe that you are confessing to these gentlemen."
Aramis colored imperceptibly. "You disturb me? Oh, quite the contrary, dear friend. I swear, and as a proof of what I say, permit me to declare I am rejoiced to see you safe and sound."
"Ah, he'll come round," thought D'Artagnan. "That's not bad."
"This gentleman, who is my friend, has just escaped from a serious danger," continued Aramis with unction, pointing to D'Artagnan with his hand and addressing the two ecclesiastics.
"Praise God, monsieur," replied they, bowing together. "I have not failed to do so, your reverences," replied the young man, returning their salutations.
"You arrive in good time, dear D'Artagnan," said Aramis, "and by taking part in our discussion, may assist us with your intelligence. Monsieur the Principal of Amiens, Monsieur the Curate of Montdidier, and I are arguing certain theological questions, in which we have been much interested. I shall be delighted to have your opinion."
"The opinion of a swordsman can have very little weight," replied D'Artagnan, who began to be uneasy at the turn things were taking. "And you had better be satisfied, believe me, with the knowledge of these gentlemen."
The two men in black bowed in their turn. "On the contrary," replied Aramis, "your opinion will be very valuable. The question is this: Monsieur the Principal thinks that my thesis ought to be dogmatic and didactic."
"Your thesis? Are you then making a thesis?"
"Without doubt," replied the Jesuit. "In the examination which precedes ordination, a thesis is always a requisite."
"Ordination?" cried D'Artagnan, who could not believe what the hostess and Bazin had successively told him, and he gazed half stupefied upon the three persons before him.
"Now,"
continued Aramis, taking the same graceful position in his easy chair that he would have assumed in bed, and complacently examining his hand, which was as white and plump as that of a woman, and which he held in the air to cause the blood to descend.
"Now, as you have heard, D'Artagnan, Monsieur the Principal is desirous that my thesis should be dogmatic, while I, for my part, would rather it should be ideal. This is the reason why Monsieur the Principal has proposed to me the following subject, which has not yet been treated upon, and in which I perceive there is matter for magnificent elaboration. Utraque manus in benedicendo clericis inferioribus necessaria est."
D'Artagnan, whose erudition we are well acquainted with, evinced no more interest on hearing this quotation than he had at that of M. de Tréville in allusion to the gifts he pretended that D'Artagnan had received from the Duke of Buckingham.
"Which means," resumed Aramis, that he might perfectly understand, "the two hands are indispensable for priests of the inferior orders when they bestow the benediction."
"An admirable subject!" cried the Jesuit. "Admirable and dogmatic!" repeated the curate, who, about as strong as D'Artagnan with respect to Latin, carefully watched the Jesuit in order to keep step with him, and repeated his words like an echo.
As to D'Artagnan, he remained perfectly insensible to the enthusiasm of the two men in black. "Yes, admirable. Porthos admirabile," continued Aramis, "but which requires a profound study of both the Scriptures and the Fathers. Now, I have confessed to these learned ecclesiastics, and that in all humility, that the duties of mounting guard and the service of the king have caused me to neglect study a little. I should find myself, therefore, more at my ease, facilis natans, in a subject of my own choice, which would be to these hard theological questions what morals are to metaphysics in philosophy." D'Artagnan began to be tired, and so did the curate.
"See, what an exordium!" cried the Jesuit. "Exordium," repeated the curate for the sake of saying something. "Quem modum inter celorum imnestitatum."
Aramis cast a glance upon D'Artagnan to see what effect all this produced, and found his friend gaping enough to split his jaws. "Let us speak French, my father," said he to the Jesuit. "Monsieur D'Artagnan will enjoy our conversation better."
"Yes," replied D'Artagnan,
"I am fatigued with reading, and all this Latin confuses me."
"Certainly,"
replied the Jesuit, a little put out, while the curate, greatly delighted, turned upon D'Artagnan a look of full gratitude.
"Well, let us see what is to be derived from this gloss. Moses, the servant of God, he was but a servant. Please to understand, Moses, blessed with his hands. He held out both his arms while the Hebrews beat their enemies, and then he blessed them with his 2 hands. Besides, what does the gospel say? Imponite manus, and not manum, place the hands, not the hand."
"Place the hands," repeated the curate with a gesture.
"Saint Peter, on the contrary, of whom the popes are the successors," continued the Jesuit. "Porrige gigitos, present the fingers. Are you there now?"
"Certes," replied Aramis in a pleased tone, "but the thing is subtle."
"The fingers," resumed the Jesuit. "Saint Peter blessed with the fingers. The Pope therefore blesses with the fingers. And with how many fingers does he bless? With 3 fingers, to be sure, 1 for the Father, 1 for the Son, and 1 for the Holy Ghost."
All crossed themselves. D'Artagnan thought it was proper to follow this example.
"The Pope is the successor of Saint Peter, and represents the 3 divine powers. The rest, ordines inferiores, of the ecclesiastical hierarchy bless in the name of the holy archangels and angels. The most humble clerks, such as our deacons and sacristans, bless with holy water sprinklers, which resemble an infinite number of blessing fingers. There is the subject simplified. Argumentum omni denudatum ornamento. I could make of that subject 2 volumes of this size," continued the Jesuit, and in his enthusiasm he struck a Saint Chrysostom in folio, which made the table bend beneath its weight. D'Artagnan trembled. "Certes," said Aramis, "I do justice to the beauties of this thesis, but at the same time I perceive it would be overwhelming for me. I had chosen this text, tell me, dear D'Artagnan, if it is not to your taste. Non inutile est desiderium in oblatione. That is, a little regret is not unsuitable in an offering to the Lord." "Stop there," cried the Jesuit, "for that thesis touches closely upon heresy. There is a proposition almost like it in the Augustinus of the Heresiarch Jansenius, whose book will sooner or later be burned by the hands of the executioner. Take care, my young friend. You are inclining toward false doctrines, my young friend. You will be lost." "You will be lost," said the curate, shaking his head sorrowfully. "You approach that famous point of free will, which is a mortal rock. You face the insinuations of the Pelagians and the semi-Pelagians." "But, my reverend," replied Aramis, a little amazed by the shower of arguments that poured upon his head. "How will you prove," continued the Jesuit without allowing him time to speak, "that we ought to regret the world when we offer ourselves to God? Listen to this dilemma. God is God, and the world is the devil. To regret the world is to regret the devil. That is my conclusion." "And that is mine also," said the curate. "But, for heaven's sake," resumed Aramis. "Desideras diabolum, unhappy man!" cried the Jesuit. "He regrets the devil. Ah, my young friend," added the curate, groaning, "do not regret the devil, I implore you." D'Artagnan felt himself bewildered. It seemed to him as though he were in a madhouse and was becoming as mad as those he saw. He was, however, forced to hold his tongue from not comprehending half the language they employed. "But listen to me, then," resumed Aramis with politeness mingled with a little impatience. "I do not say I regret. No, I will never pronounce that sentence, which would not be orthodox." The Jesuit raised his hands toward heaven, and the curate did the same. "No, but pray grant me that it is acting with an ill grace to offer to the Lord only that which we are perfectly disgusted. Don't you think so, D'Artagnan?" "I think so indeed," cried he. The Jesuit and the curate quite started from their chairs. "This is the point of departure. It is a syllogism. The world is not wanting in attractions. I quit the world, then I make a sacrifice. Now the Scripture says positively, 'Make a sacrifice unto the Lord.'" "That is true," said his antagonist. "And then," said Aramis, pinching his ear to make it red as he rubbed his hands to make them white, "and then I made a certain rondeau upon it last year, which I showed to Monsieur Voiture, and that great man paid me 1,000 compliments." "A rondeau!" said the Jesuit disdainfully. "A rondeau!" said the curate mechanically. "Repeat it! Repeat it!" cried D'Artagnan. "It will make a little change." "Not so, for it is religious," replied Aramis. "It is theology in verse." "The devil!" said D'Artagnan. "Here it is," said Aramis, with a little look of diffidence, which, however, was not exempt from a shade of hypocrisy. "Vous qui pleurez un pas plein de charme, et qui traînez des jours infortunes, tous vos malheurs se verront terminés, quand Dieu seul vos offrira vos larmes, vous qui pleurez. You who weep for pleasures fled, while dragging on a life of care, all your woes will melt in air, if to God your tears are shed, you who weep." D'Artagnan and the curate appeared pleased. The Jesuit persisted in his opinion. "Beware of a profane taste in your theological style. What says Augustine on this subject? Severus sit clericorum verbo." "Yes, let the sermon be clear," said the curate. "Now," hastily interrupted the Jesuit, on seeing that his acolyte was going astray, "now your thesis would please the ladies. It would have the success of one of Monsieur Patrou's pleadings." "Please God!" cried Aramis, transported. "Therefore it is," cried the Jesuit, "the world still speaks within you in a loud voice. Altissime voce! You follow the world, my young friend, and I tremble lest grace prove not efficacious. Be satisfied, my reverend father. I can answer for myself. Mundane presumption! I know myself, father. My resolution is irrevocable. Then you persist in continuing that thesis? I feel myself called upon to treat that and no other. I will see about the continuation of it, and tomorrow I hope you will be satisfied with the corrections I shall have made in consequence of your advice. Work slowly, said the curate. We leave you in an excellent tone of mind. Yes, the ground is all sown, said the Jesuit, and we have not to fear that one portion of the seed may have fallen upon stone, another upon the highway, or that the birds of heaven have eaten the rest. Aves Jali, comederunt illam. Plague stifle you in your Latin, said D'Artagnan, who began to feel all his patience exhausted. Farewell, my son, said the curate, till tomorrow. Till tomorrow, rash youth, said the Jesuit. You promised to become one of the lights of the church. Heaven grant that this light prove not a devouring fire. D'Artagnan, who for an hour past had been gnawing his nails with impatience, was beginning to attack the quick. The two men in black rose, bowed to Aramis and D'Artagnan, and advanced toward the door. Bazin, who had been standing listening to all this controversy with a pious jubilation, sprang toward them, took the breviary of the curate and the missal of the Jesuit, and walked respectively before them to clear their way. Aramis conducted them to the foot of the stairs, and then immediately came up again to D'Artagnan, whose senses were still in a state of confusion. When left alone, the two friends at first kept an embarrassed silence. It, however, became necessary for one of them to break it first, and as D'Artagnan appeared determined to leave that honor to his companion, Aramis said, "You see that I am returned to my fundamental ideas." "Yes, efficacious grace has touched you, as that gentleman said just now." "Oh, these plans of retreat have been formed for a long time. You have often heard me speak of them, have you not, my friend?" "Yes, but I confess I always thought you jested." "With such things? Oh, D'Artagnan!" "The devil! Why, people jest with death." "And people are wrong, D'Artagnan, for death is the door which leads to perdition or to salvation." "Granted, but if you please, let us not theologize, Aramis. You must have had enough for today. As for me, I have almost forgotten the little Latin I have ever known. Then I confess to you that I have eaten nothing since 10 o'clock this morning, and I am devilishly hungry." "We will dine directly, my friend. Only, you must please to remember that this is Friday. Now, on such a day, I can neither eat flesh nor see it eaten. If you can be satisfied with my dinner, it consists of cooked tetragones and fruits." "What do you mean by tetragones?" asked D'Artagnan uneasily. "I mean spinach," replied Aramis. "But on your account I will add some eggs, and that is a serious infraction of the rule, for eggs are meat, since they engender chickens." "This feast is not very succulent, but never mind, I will put up with it for the sake of remaining with you." "I am grateful to you for your sacrifice," said Aramis. "But if your body be not greatly benefited by it, be assured your soul will." "And so, Aramis, you are decidedly going into the church. What will our two friends say? What will Monsieur de Tréville say? They will treat you as a deserter, I warn you." "I do not enter the church, I re-enter it. I deserted the church for the world, for you know that I forced myself when I became a musketeer." I know nothing about it.
You don't know I quit the seminary?
Not at all.
This is my story, then. Besides, the scriptures say, 'Confess yourself to one another,' and I confess to you, D'Artagnan."
"And I give you absolution beforehand. You see, I am a good sort of man."
"Do not jest about holy things, my friend."
"Go on, then. I listen."
"I had been at the seminary from 9 years old. In 3 days I should have been 20. I was about to become an abbé, and all was arranged. One evening I went according to custom to a house which I frequented with much pleasure. When one is young, what can be expected? One is weak. An officer who saw me with a jealous eye, reading the lives of the saints to the mistress of the house, entered suddenly and without being announced. That evening I had translated an episode of Judith, and had just communicated my verses to the lady, who gave me all sorts of compliments, and leaning on my shoulder, was reading them a second time with me. Her pose, which I must admit was rather free, wounded this officer. He said nothing, but when I went out, he followed and came up with me quickly. 'Monsieur the Abbé,' said he, 'do you like blows with a cane?' 'I cannot say, monsieur,' answered I. 'No one has ever dared to give me any.' 'Well, listen to me then, Monsieur the Abbé. If you venture again into that house in which I have met you this evening, I will dare it myself.' I really think I must have been frightened. I became very pale. I felt my legs fail me. I sought for a reply, but could find none. I was silent. The officer waited for his reply, and seeing it so long coming, he burst into a laugh, turned upon his heel, and re-entered the house. I returned to the seminary. I am a gentleman born, and my blood is warm, as you may have remarked, my dear D'Artagnan. The insult was terrible, and although unknown to the rest of the world, I felt it live and fester in the bottom of my heart. I informed my superiors that I did not feel myself sufficiently prepared for ordination, and at my request, the ceremony was postponed for a year. I sought out the best fencing master in Paris. I made an agreement with him to take a lesson every day, and every day for a year I took that lesson. Then, on the anniversary of the day on which I had been insulted, I hung my cassock on a peg, assumed the costume of a cavalier, and went to a ball given by a lady friend of mine, and to which I knew my man was invited. It was in the Rue des Francs Bourgeois, close to La Fosse. As I expected, my officer was there. I went up to him as he was signing a love ditty, and looking tenderly at a lady, and interrupted him exactly in the middle of the second couplet. "Monsieur," said I, "does it still displease you that I should frequent a certain house of La Rue Payenne? And would you still cane me if I took it into my head to disobey you?" The officer looked at me with astonishment and said, "What is your business with me, monsieur? I do not know you." "I am," said I, "the little abbé who reads lives of the saints and translates Judith into verse." "Aha, I recollect you now," said the officer in a jeering tone. "Well, what do you want with me?" "I want you to spare time to take a walk with me." "Tomorrow morning, if you like, with the greatest pleasure." "No, not tomorrow morning, if you please, but immediately." "If you absolutely insist." "I do insist upon it." "Come then, ladies," said the officer. "Do not disturb yourselves. Allow me time just to kill this gentleman, and I will return and finish the last couplet." We went out. I took him to the Rue Payenne, to the exact spot where, a year before, at the very same hour, he had paid me the compliment I have related to you. It was a superb moonlit night. We immediately drew, and at the first pass I laid him stark dead. "The devil!" cried D'Artagnan. "Now," continued Aramis, "as the ladies did not see the singer come back, and as he was found in the Rue Payenne with a great sword wound through his body, it was supposed that I had accommodated him thus, and the matter created some scandal, which obliged me to renounce the cassock for a time.
Athos, whose acquaintance I made about that period, and Porthos, who had, in addition to my lessons, taught me some effective tricks of fence, prevailed upon me to solicit the uniform of a musketeer. The king entertained great regard for my father, who had fallen at the siege of Arras, and the uniform was granted. You may understand that the moment has come for me to re-enter the bosom of the church."
"And why today, rather than yesterday or tomorrow? What has happened to you today to raise all these melancholy ideas?"
"This wound, my dear D'Artagnan, has been a warning to me from heaven."
"This wound? Bah! It is now nearly healed, and I am sure it is not that which gives you the most pain."
"What, then?" said Aramis, blushing.
"You have one at heart, Aramis, one deeper and more painful, a wound made by a woman." The eye of Aramis kindled in spite of himself.
"Ah,"
said he, dissembling his emotion under a feigned carelessness,
"do not talk of such things and suffer love pains. Vanitas vanitatum. According to your idea, then, my brain is turned. And for whom for? Some grisette? Some chambermaid with whom I have trifled in some garrison? Fie!"
"Pardon, my dear Aramis, but I thought you carried your eyes higher."
"Higher? And who am I, to nourish such ambition? A poor musketeer, a beggar, an unknown who hates slavery and finds himself ill-placed in the world?"
"Aramis, Aramis!" cried D'Artagnan, looking at his friend with an air of doubt.
"Dust I am, and to dust I return. Life is full of humiliations and sorrows,"
continued he, becoming still more melancholy.
"All the ties which attach him to life break in the hand of man, particularly the golden ties. Ah, my dear D'Artagnan,"
resumed Aramis, giving to his voice a slight tone of bitterness,
"trust me. Conceal your wounds when you have any. Silence is the last joy of the unhappy. Beware of giving anyone the clue to your griefs. The curious suck our tears as flies suck the blood of a wounded heart."
"Alas, my dear Aramis," said D'Artagnan in his turn, heaving a profound sigh, "that is my story you are relating."
"How?"
"Yes, a woman whom I love, whom I adore, has just been torn from me by force. I do not know where she is or whither they have conducted her. She is perhaps a prisoner. She is perhaps dead."
"Yes, but you have at least this consolation, that you can say to yourself she has not quit you voluntarily, that if you learn no news of her, it is because all communication with you is interdicted, while I—"
"Well?"
"Nothing,"
replied Aramis.
"Nothing."
"So you renounce the world, then? Forever? That is a settled thing? A resolution registered?"
"Forever. You are my friend today. Tomorrow you will be no more to me than a shadow, or rather, even you will no longer exist. As for the world, it is a sepulchre, and nothing else."
"The devil! All this is very sad which you tell me."
"What will you? My vocation commands me. It carries me away."
D'Artagnan smiled, but made no answer. Aramis continued,
"And yet, while I do belong to the earth, I wish to speak of you, of our friends."
"And on my part," said D'Artagnan, "I wish to speak of you, but I find you so completely detached from everything. To love you cry, fie! Friends or shadows? The world is a sepulchre."
"Alas, you will find it so yourself,"
said Aramis with a sigh. "Well, then, let us say no more about it," said D'Artagnan, "and let us burn this letter, which no doubt announces to you some fresh infidelity of your grisette or your chambermaid."
"What letter?" cried Aramis eagerly. "A letter which was sent to your abode in your absence, and which was given to me for you."
"But from whom is that letter?"
"Oh, from some heartbroken waiting woman, some desponding grisette, from Madame de Chevreuse's chambermaid perhaps, who was obliged to return to Tours with her mistress, and who, in order to appear smart and attractive, stole some perfumed paper and sealed her letter with a duchess's coronet."
"What do you say?"
"Hold, I must have lost it," said the young man maliciously, pretending to search for it. "But fortunately the world is a sepulchre. The men, and consequently the women, are but shadows, and love is a sentiment to which you cry, 'Fie! Fie!'"
"D'Artagnan! D'Artagnan!" cried Aramis. "You are killing me!"
"Well, here it is at last," said D'Artagnan as he drew the letter from his pocket. Aramis made a bound, seized the letter, read it, or rather devoured it, his countenance radiant. "The same waiting maid seems to have an agreeable style," said the messenger carelessly.
"Thanks, D'Artagnan, thanks!"
cried Aramis, almost in a state of delirium.
"She was forced to return to Tours. She is not faithless. She still loves me. Come, my friend, come. Let me embrace you. Happiness almost stifles me."
The two friends began to dance around the venerable Saint Chrysostom, kicking about famously the sheets of the thesis which had fallen on the floor. At that moment, Bazin entered with the spinach and the omelette.
"Be off, you wretch!"
cried Aramis, throwing his skull cap in his face.
"Return whence you came. Take back those horrible vegetables and that poor kickshaw. Order a larded hare, a fat capon, mutton leg dressed with garlic, and 4 bottles of old Burgundy."
Bazin, who looked at his master without comprehending the cause of this change, in a melancholy manner, allowed the omelette to slip into the spinach, and the spinach onto the floor. "Now this is the moment to consecrate your existence to the King of Kings," said D'Artagnan. "If you persist in offering him a civility, non inutile desiderium oblatione."
"Go to the devil with your Latin. Let us drink, my dear D'Artagnan. Morbleu, let us drink while the wine is fresh. Let us drink heartily, and while we do so, tell me a little of what is going on in the world yonder."
End of chapter 26. Recording by John Van Stan, Savannah, Georgia.
All right. So I didn't give you a heads up about Aramis and his white hands because I just kind of wanted that to flow into your ears without any warning. I loved that he was constantly holding his hands up so that the blood would drain from them, so his hands would be more delicate and white. And that he was pinching his ears to make them pinker, but keeping his hands up to keep them whiter. I don't know what's going on with the pink ears. Maybe it's just healthy looks or something. I'm not sure, but I love it. They're vain in such interesting ways. Porthos with his clothes, Aramis with his intellect and his graceful looks and manners. And then we're going to get to Athos, of course, next week. I actually thought the theological conversation over whether you bless with hand or hands or fingers was kind of interesting, because with texts that have been translated out of ancient languages, there's always a lot more wiggle room in interpretation. There's a lot more room for interpretation, period. Much like I know I've mentioned it on the podcast before, if you go back to the original Hebrew of the 10 Commandments, it isn't don't take the Lord's name in vain. It's don't bear false witness. Don't use the Lord's name for your own small human purposes. That's bad. That as a commandment makes a whole lot more sense than don't say, oh my God, is what I'm saying. So the interesting implications of some of these theological conversations can be really fascinating. Whether a priest should lay their hands on someone to help/heal them, or just use 3 fingers like the Pope does for the Trinity. That does not seem to me to be as useful a conversation to have as the one that I shared about the 10 Commandments. So I think that was where Dumas was going with this. So that, yes, Aramis bounds out of his chair as soon as he finds out that his lady still loves him, and he totally throws off all the trappings of the church and immediately dives into a nice big juicy steak. All of that is true. But it also isn't like he was leaving behind a whole lot. You know what I mean? Dumas really set this up so that even if you were religious as a reader of this book at the time that it was released, and you felt like for Aramis, going into the church was not a bad idea. It was going to be better for his soul. It was going to be better for his life. All of those things are true, but you aren't going to feel bad about him walking away from it. It's not like he would have had, as far as Dumas lays out for us, a particularly fulfilling time hanging out with at least these particular clergymen. I also thought that the whole thing about eating eggs being a great sacrifice was awesome. And the whole spinach. Well, we could put spinach in it for you. Oh, thank you. Wow. Yay, spinach. The whole chapter does make me think about Cyrano. I wonder if we could get a cast together and do Cyrano. God, I would love to do that. I love that play, the original. And Steve Martin's Roxanne is also excellent, as is Depardieu's Cyrano. I haven't watched the new one. But yeah, I wonder if we could do that. Let me know if you or someone you know might be interested in reading that play into a microphone, doing the parts. Contemplating. So at the very last second, I got an email from Caroline J, and she gave me permission to read this to you, and so I am doing it at the 11th hour. She said, longtime listener, first-time emailer, in episode 624, you asked for input from someone who is a sword fighter about the big sword fight in the first 20 minutes of the Gene Kelly Three Musketeers. Well, I'm your gal, and I'm emailing you because brevity is not my forte, and there's lots of stuff that might be interesting to know. So, Caroline, you have found your people with me. She said, I have studied historical fencing for the better part of a decade, studying medieval and Renaissance fencing manuals that date to the mid-17th century at the latest. I study mostly Italian-style fencing with some dabbling in German and Spanish style. I'm not familiar with the French style and how it might differ from Italian, but there's really only so many things you can do with a sword. The swords the Musketeers use in the book are rapiers. The blades have a diamond-shaped cross-section and are quite flexible. Épées and foils are 2 other types of small, flexible swords common at that time. Épées have triangular cross-sections, and the foils are square. Wounds from an épée or foil are dang near impossible to suture, meaning those wounds were almost always deadly. Rapier stab wounds are tricky, but not impossible to suture, so the main concern with that would be infection. The fact that D'Artagnan is stabbed in the chest and his rib stops the blade is actually pretty lucky. Generally, when a rapier blade hits a rib, the blade will flex and slip between the ribs and through the chest cavity. It only takes a few pounds of pressure for a sharp sword point to puncture the skin. And when you're fighting at full speed, you're using much more pressure than that. And then she said, I've included a picture I took recently at my local SCA fencing practice showing the blade flexing while fencing at full speed. For safety, we use rubber arrow blunts on the sword tips, and the blades are not sharp. The second attachment is an illustration from Capoferro's treatise on fencing, which was published in 1610. So we will put these pictures into the show notes so that you guys can see them too. Now, on to the fight scene in the movie. First, I have to say that the fencing you see on the stage or the screen is an entirely different animal than sport or historical fencing. Stage fencing is choreographed to look and sound flashy with a healthy dose of don't actually stab your opponent thrown in for safety. The fighting in the 1948 Three Musketeers is, in fact, stage fencing. Almost all of what you see is not what would happen in an actual 5-on-4 sword fight. The footwork in that fight was fairly accurate, though not the best form outside of the fancy choreographed bits. Historically accurate sword fighting is harder to follow and much less exciting to watch unless you're familiar with it. Sport fencing is a bit more exciting, but still far from stage fencing. Rapiers are thrusting weapons primarily and slicing weapons second. There are several Renaissance-era fencing manuals that talk about making cuts by swinging your arm, but those kinds of movements take a long time, and instead you could just thrust your sword into your opponent. Think of the fighting scene in Indiana Jones where the man is swinging the scimitar around him, being very flashy and intimidating, but Indiana just shoots him. My fencing instructors say the first rule of fencing is don't die, and the second rule is kill the other guy. If you consider the fact that dueling is largely illegal at the time, and deadly more often than not, you'll want to be sure to be as efficient in your movements as possible in order to survive and win in the process, ideally, and escape before the authorities arrive. The sword fight in Princess Bride is also entirely stage fencing, but all the fencing masters that Inigo and Wesley mention are actual historical fencing masters with surviving manuals and treatises. If you want something from a movie that is the most historically accurate that I've ever seen, watch the training montage in The Mask of Zorro with Anthony Hopkins and Antonio Banderas, which we just watched. I am so excited. It really is fabulous. I'd forgotten how good it was. That training montage specifically is pretty historically accurate Spanish-style fencing, but the rest of the movie is just stage fencing. I think I've info dumped enough, so I'll wrap it up here. If you need or want anything expanded upon, let me know. I love this. Thank you so much, Caroline, for writing in with that. I just love getting this kind of insider info on stuff like this. Thank you. All right, I think that's it. Please enjoy taking a look at the notes in the PDF. Thank you again to our patrons. Every week I will be reading new names, but right now, the ones again to thank for this week are Jennifer L., Sarah B., Kathy S., Kimberly K., Lisa B., and Madeline D. Thank you so much for making this possible. And thank you too to everybody who went over to my Substack, the initforthelonghaul.substack.com. It was really lovely to log on yesterday to post the update and then see so many names of people I knew from